There's a mass exodus happening that nobody's talking about. The most conscious, aware, psychologically developed people are quietly disappearing. Not dramatically, not with announcements or explanations. They're just gone. Off social media, out of corporate jobs, away from their old friend groups, choosing solitude over society, silence over noise, disappearance over participation. Carl Jung not only predicted this, he said it was inevitable. He discovered that genuine spiritual awakening creates a fundamental incompatibility with normal society. And the more conscious you become, the less you can tolerate unconscious environments, until one day you simply can't anymore, and you disappear. Today I'm revealing why Jung believed awakened people inevitably withdraw from society, why this isn't spiritual bypassing or escapism, but psychological necessity, and why this disappearance is actually preparing something the world desperately needs. If you've been feeling the pull to disappear, this will explain why. Here's what Jung understood that changes everything. Society runs on collective unconsciousness, shared delusions, mass projections, agreed upon shadows. These aren't bugs in the system, they are the system. And the system only functions when everyone participates unconsciously. The moment someone truly wakes up, not intellectually but psychologically, they become incompatible with the system. They can see the projections everyone else is living. They recognize the shadows everyone's avoiding. They understand the games everyone's playing unconsciously. And once you see it, you can't participate anymore. So awakened people start disappearing, not from hatred of society, but from inability to remain in it without betraying their consciousness. Every day demands they pretend to be asleep. Every interaction requires they dim their light. Every relationship asks they be less than they've become. And eventually, the psyche says, enough. Withdraw. Preserve your consciousness. The first reason why might be the most painful. Jung's first insight. Awakened people disappear because they can no longer tolerate witnessing the collective shadow. Once you've integrated your personal shadow, watching society's mass projections becomes psychologically unbearable. Think about what happens when you've done shadow work. You've faced your own capacity for evil. You've owned your darkness. You've integrated what you previously projected. And then you look at society, and you see shadow projection everywhere. Wars are collective shadows clashing. Political divisions are mass projections. Social media outrage is shadow material seeking targets. One of Jung's patients described what happened after her shadow integration. I used to participate in political discussions with passion. Then I integrated my shadow and saw that both sides were violently projecting their unconscious material while calling it justice or truth. I couldn't participate anymore. It would be like joining a mass delusion. I had to step back, not from superiority, but from sanity. This is what Jung meant by the burden of seeing. You can't join the mob when you see it's hunting its own shadow. You can't pick sides when you understand both sides are projecting. You can't engage in collective blame when you recognize it as collective unconsciousness. So, you withdraw. But here's what makes this unbearable. You're not just seeing the collective shadow, you're feeling it. When you become conscious, you become energetically sensitive. Being around unconscious shadow projection feels like psychological violence. It's not judgment. It's genuine somatic incompatibility. Jung noticed this in his own life after his individuation. Being in crowds became almost unbearable, not because he disliked people, but because he could feel the unconscious material swirling. The projections, repressions, shadows creating a psychological storm that only he seemed aware of. You'll notice awakened people disappear from social media first. It's a 24/7 shadow projection machine. Every scroll is an assault of unconscious material. Every comment section is shadow boxing. For someone who's integrated their shadow, it's like being forced to watch people punch themselves while blaming others for the bruises. This isn't spiritual bypassing, it's psychological self-preservation. The awakened person isn't running away. They're protecting the consciousness they've worked so hard to develop from constant bombardment by unconscious material. But if witnessing collective shadow is painful, the second reason awakened people disappear is even more isolating. This is Jung's most devastating insight. Awakened people disappear because their authentic self can no longer perform the persona that society demands. And society demands nothing but persona performance. Before awakening, you could play the social games unconsciously, smile when expected, say the right things, perform your role. But once you've touched your authentic self, that deeper truth beyond all masks, going back to persona performance feels like psychological death. Every social situation demands performance. The workplace persona, the family role, the social media identity, the acceptable opinions. For someone still identified with their persona, this feels normal. For someone who's found their self, it feels like suffocation. Jung discovered this through personal experience. After his confrontation with the unconscious, he couldn't perform the proper Swiss psychiatrist anymore. He couldn't pretend to agree with collective opinions he saw through. He couldn't maintain relationships that required him to be false. So he withdrew to Bollingen, his tower by the lake, where he could be authentically himself. One of Jung's patients, a successful executive who'd undergone individuation, described the impossibility. I sit in board meetings and everyone's performing their executive roles, saying what executives should say, thinking what executives should think. I can't do it anymore. It's like being asked to pretend I'm someone I've never been. My authentic self has no voice in that room. Only my persona did, and it's dead. She didn't dramatically quit. She quietly disappeared, transitioning out over months, moving to a small town where she could be real rather than successful. Not from failure, but from the success of finding herself. This is happening everywhere. Awakened people are leaving careers that require persona performance, ending relationships based on false selves, abandoning social circles that demand masks. They're not failing at society, they're succeeding at authenticity, and that success makes societal participation impossible. You'll notice awakened people become increasingly unavailable. They decline invitations. They don't respond to messages. They're mysteriously busy. They're not being rude, they're being honest. They can't show up as their personas anymore, and their authentic selves don't fit in those spaces. So, they disappear. But there's a deeper reason for this disappearance that Jung discovered through observing his most conscious patients. Here's what Jung understood about why awakened people disappear. Maintaining consciousness in unconscious environments requires massive psychological energy, and eventually, that energy cost becomes unsustainable. Think about what conscious people have to do in normal society. Constantly filter out unconscious projections, maintain boundaries against energy vampires, translate between depth and surface, hold their frequency while surrounded by static, process not just their own material, but the unconscious material everyone else is leaking. Jung called this psychological labor, the invisible work conscious people do just to exist in unconscious spaces. Every interaction requires you to not react to projections, not absorb others' unconscious material, not get pulled into collective dramas, not match the unconscious frequency around you, not betray your truth to maintain harmony. For unconscious people, this isn't work. They're flowing with the collective current. For conscious people, it's like swimming upstream in a tsunami. Eventually, you have to get out of the water or drown. Jung noticed that his most conscious patients would develop chronic fatigue, mysterious illnesses, depression, not from personal pathology, but from the exhaustion of maintaining consciousness in unconscious environments. The cure wasn't therapy, it was withdrawal. One woman, a teacher who had awakened through years of inner work, developed severe chronic fatigue. Medical tests showed nothing wrong. Through analysis with Jung, she realized she was expending massive energy maintaining her consciousness while surrounded by unconscious colleagues and students all day. She wasn't sick, she was energetically depleted. When she left teaching and moved to a cabin in nature, her energy returned within weeks. Not from rest, but from no longer having to maintain consciousness against the constant pressure of collective unconsciousness. This is why awakened people disappear to nature, to solitude, to small conscious communities, not to escape responsibility, but to preserve the consciousness they have developed. They understand that consciousness is precious and finite, and spending it on unconscious interactions is like pouring water into sand. You'll notice awakened people have less and less bandwidth for normal socializing. What used to be easy, dinner parties, networking events, casual hangouts, becomes exhausting. Not because they're antisocial, but because the energy required to maintain their consciousness in those environments exceeds what they receive from the interaction. But there's one final reason Jung identified that explains why this disappearance isn't just withdrawal, it's preparation. If you've been feeling the pull to disappear, if being around unconscious people leaves you depleted, if you're choosing solitude over society more and more, Jung would say you're not antisocial. You're protecting something precious, your consciousness. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get true self-discovery. Now, this final insight reveals why your disappearance might be serving something larger than yourself. This is Jung's most profound insight. Awakened people aren't just disappearing, they're entering what he called the hermit phase, an archetypal pattern that every individuating person must walk, not permanently, but necessarily. The psyche requires solitude to integrate what society would fragment. The hermit archetype isn't about misanthropy. It's about psychological necessity. When you're transforming at a fundamental level, you need space from influences that would pull you back to old patterns. You need silence to hear your inner voice. You need solitude to integrate without interference. Jung himself went through profound hermit phases. His years at Bollingen weren't vacation. They were psychological necessity. He needed distance from collective consciousness to develop individual consciousness. He needed separation from others' projections to understand his own depths. This is what's happening to awakening people now. They're not disappearing because they're weak or antisocial. They're following an archetypal pattern that individuation requires. The hermit phase is when the shadow integrates without social pressure to repress it. The self emerges without persona demands. Inner wisdom develops without outer noise. Psychological transformation completes without interruption. But here's what Jung emphasized. The hermit phase isn't escape, it's preparation. The awakened person withdraws not to abandon society, but to develop something society needs. They're gestating wisdom, integrating truth, becoming what Jung called aquarium fish, beings who've adapted to depths others can't reach. One of Jung's analysans, a philosopher, disappeared from academic life for 3 years. Everyone thought he'd had a breakdown. He'd had a breakthrough. In solitude, he integrated insights that would have been impossible while maintaining his academic persona. When he returned, he brought revolutionary ideas, but they could only emerge in withdrawal from the very system they would eventually transform. The hermit phase looks like disappearance, but it's actually deepening. The awakened person isn't running away. They're going deeper than society allows. They're doing work that can only be done in solitude, developing consciousness that might eventually help the collective, but only after it's fully formed. You'll notice awakened people who disappear often do very specific work in solitude: shadow integration, trauma healing, consciousness expansion, creative gestation. They're not hiding, they're transforming. And transformation requires withdrawal from the very thing you're transforming beyond. Why spiritually awakened people are disappearing from society? They can't tolerate witnessing the collective shadow anymore. Their authentic self can't perform the personas society demands. The energy cost of maintaining consciousness in unconscious spaces becomes unsustainable. They're entering the necessary hermit phase that individuation requires. Jung would want you to understand, this disappearance isn't failure, it's evolution, not weakness but wisdom, not abandonment but archetypal necessity. The awakened are following a pattern as old as consciousness itself: withdraw, transform, return transformed. Society experiences this as loss. Where did all the conscious people go? Why are the wisest voices getting quieter? But Jung would say, they're not abandoning the collective. They're preparing something for it. In their withdrawal, they're developing what collective consciousness isn't ready for yet. In their disappearance, they're creating spaces for others to disappear to. In their silence, they're gestating words the collective can't yet hear. This isn't permanent exile. Jung observed that the disappeared eventually return, but differently. Not to participate in unconsciousness, but to offer consciousness to those ready to receive it. They become border dwellers, present but not absorbed, available but not consumed. If you're feeling the pull to disappear, Jung would want you to know, this isn't spiritual bypassing, it's psychological necessity. Your consciousness has developed to a point where participating in collective unconsciousness is no longer possible without betraying yourself. The withdrawal you're feeling isn't antisocial, it's archetypal. You're not abandoning society. You're following the hermit's path that every individuating person must walk. You're not weak for being unable to tolerate unconsciousness. You're conscious, and consciousness requires different conditions than sleep. Let yourself disappear, not forever, but for now. Find your Bolingen, whether it's physical solitude or psychological distance. Stop expending your consciousness on unconscious interactions. Stop performing for audiences that can't see you. Stop translating your depth into surface terms. Your disappearance isn't selfish, it's necessary. The collective needs people who fully individuated more than it needs people who partially participate. It needs depth more than surface, authenticity more than performance, consciousness more than conformity. And when you return, if you return, you'll return with gifts that could only be developed in disappearance. You'll offer what couldn't be offered while maintaining false belonging. You'll speak truths that couldn't be spoken while performing acceptance. Subscribe to explore Jung's insights for those walking the path of conscious withdrawal. To dive even deeper into Jung's revolutionary psychology and what it means for your spiritual awakening, click the recommended video on your screen now.